Aerial combat. You know, planes in the sky with pilots in them, flying around doing combat in the air. In World War I, it was referred to as gentlemanly warfare. In World War II, it was not referred as that, but it was really cool because they got even more advanced. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to start with World War I and early flight. We're going to talk about I was holding my breath for a long time. We're going to talk about World War II, in which we got even more advanced, better planes, better pilots, and then we're going to talk about modern aerial combat and possibly the future of it. So buckle up, get your rebreather on. It's not a rebreather. Get your mask on and get ready to go on a flying adventure. We're going to fly through my presentation. Okay, so starting in the early 1900s, planes looked something like that. They were very basic. A lot of them were made out of basic materials. Earlier planes, the earliest planes, in fact, were made out of little more than just wood and fabric. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And then in the mid-1900s, as you can see behind me, planes got more advanced. They became made of metal. They got faster, better in really every way. Okay, the first flight was at Kitty Hawk. Oh God, I forgot the state. It was at Kitty Hawk. And this is the first manned flight in a plane. It was called the Wright Flyer, and that was in 1903, just 11 short years before World War I would start. And that was found on the National Air and Space Museum. This was Smithsonian, is where I got that from. In World War I, like I said, 11 years after the first flight, so planes were very new at the time. And before planes, they had zeppelins, aerial balloons, things like that. And those were primarily used by Germany, but there were some other countries who did have big zeppelins, and they served all the functions of modern planes, really. They were bombers, reconnaissance, they could do a lot. And eventually, they did get into, mass-producing planes, like these here. These are some German fighters, and with the invention of the plane, aerial combat got faster, a lot faster. Zeppelins were not fast. It got cooler, a lot cooler, and it got a lot more personal because earlier planes, you only had 1 to 3 people in them. The early cockpits of planes were actually very, very minimalist, as you can see in this picture here. And according to the Aviation Knowledge Wiki, the first cockpits had little more than compass, altimeter to tell how high they were, and some early breathing apparatuses that were actually just built into the front of the plane. And what they were is it was just like an air tank, and the pilot it was like just a little like almost straw, like a metal straw, and the pilots would just have to breathe through that. And that was for higher flights, mainly pertaining to bombers, because reconnaissance planes flew very low at the time. Mainly because a lot of people didn't quite understand flight yet, and they didn't know how to get around. So early flyers would actually fly low to the ground, and they would read like street signs and follow railroads to see where they were. Early bombers, on the other hand, those were the ones that tended to fly higher. They were bigger than normal planes, and they were manned by up to 3, 4 people. And in the early portions of the war, they didn't have the bombs strapped to anything. The people in the back or the front of the plane, the people who weren't the pilots, I guess you could call them gunners, but they didn't have guns. They would actually hang over the side of the plane and drop a bomb, like that. World War I was really experimental with aircraft, really. They didn't quite know what they were doing, and they were also really easy to shoot down. Like infantry weaponry could shoot down an airplane. Like you could fire your rifle, your pistol, your machine gun at an airplane and take it down in the early times of aerial warfare. That changed in World War II. Like I said earlier, planes got better, faster, more armored, smaller in some regards, bigger in others. This was a World War II fighter plane. They were much faster than their World War I counterparts. They figured out mounted guns finally, because in the early years of World War One, whenever they mounted guns on front of a plane, it would just chew right through the propeller, and the plane would go crashing down. They figured that out, though. The Germans figured that out, and here is an example of how planes got a lot bigger. Huge, massive bombers, often referred to as flying fortresses, were utilized in every aspect of the war, in the Western Front, in the Eastern Front, in the Pacific. Aerial combat was extremely, extremely important in World War II. It's what ended World War II with the use of the atomic bomb. After World War II, we just kept advancing. Aerial combat has kind of advanced exponentially since World War I. And so after World War II, we started developing jets from commandeered German technology, commandeered German prototypes near the end of the war. The Germans also invented the V-2 rocket, which would go on to serve as the basis for our first actual rockets into space. That's not really aerial combat, so we're not going to talk about that. But they created the first jets. Earlier jets looked like this, which isn't how a lot of people picture jets to look like, but they had jet propulsion in the back, and they would carry bombs, and a lot of them, though, were used just for reconnaissance, just for seeing what your enemy is up to, especially considering it was the Cold War. We didn't really want to go flying bombs over communist Russia or anything. Helicopters were also huge to warfare. The first helicopter was actually figured out as early as 1934, I believe, and it was just a basic one-man little flyer, little more than a bicycle with a propeller, honestly, but it was the first manned flight in a helicopter, although after World War II, we actually started developing helicopters, and this is an example of one of the first modern helicopters, if you could call it that. It's the first helicopter that was used as an attack helicopter in attack situations. They could mount guns, bombs. On this helicopter, the Sikorsky, which I got from a website called the militaryfactory.org, which is, it was a lot like a wiki, but it was reliable. And the Sikorsky was used for anywhere from rescue operations to taking people into warfare. It was utilized a lot in the Korean War, which was also the first war that really utilized helicopters at all. It was also used to help get the astronauts off of the space station, not the space station, the shuttles that would come down to Earth when they landed. That was the helicopter that got them out there. So modern aerial combat, this moves us into today. It consists primarily of drones, which is a much newer technology in comparison to all the rest, unmanned, controlled by a computer, and then jets, which is jet fighters, jet reconnaissance, things like that, and helicopters. And modern helicopters are a lot more armored, and they can carry full squads of people into combat. And helicopters have kind of started to be used more for transport than attack helicopters, although attack helicopters are still in use by every country that has access to them. And so that's the history of aerial combat. It's a bit of the modern bit, and it was also the beginning bit.